Hey everyone, we're going to start our third session. So far, it's just so wonderful. This is really a kind of a mix of cutting edge intellectual insights, bit of a nostalgia, bit of a group therapy session. Uh, I love all of this, all of the above. They're just really great. It is actually, I think Patricia was saying that this is what life research is about. We don't normally talk about this. We present a very polished version of ourselves, in most academic occasions, but this is something that's much richer, and I think it's great. And also interesting that I'm not sure whether you're all prepared to talk about your biographical details. I noticed that there's a lot of that, and talk about your journey, and this is really the productive power of this space, that it really produced the content, that the biography came out uh, just naturally. So I'm going to do something different. I'm going to ask the speakers to introduce themselves biographically or whatever details you want to introduce. Uh, and then I'm just going to read the names and titles, okay? And so the first presenter is Kelly Ritter. She's professor of architecture, professor of architectural history at Savannah College of Arts and Design. Kelly.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to be here with you today. I honestly cannot tell you how wonderful it is to just hear about everybody's current work and what they've been doing, where their research went, where it didn't go sometimes. Um, and and yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of maybe a little group therapy, but the reminiscing is really interesting too. Um, I I'm starting my second year as professor of architectural history at the Savannah College of Art and Design. And I am so thrilled to be teaching in the discipline. It's been a wonderful experience. Today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of bring you through my journey at UVA, which is longer than 10 years. I started at UVA in the master's program in 2012. So I started in the architectural history master's program, and then I was a member of the first PhD cohort in the construction environment. So I've been here a long time. Yeah, thank you. Um, and you know, going through the master's program was really formative for me. And it influenced the trajectory of my dissertation in a way that I think it would be important for all of you PhD students to possibly hear. Because what happened during my master's research is I encountered a major hurdle. So our master's program is 2 years long. Over this first summer of my program, I was lucky enough to get a Lambert Woods scholarship to go do research in Shanghai for about 2 weeks. And I was hoping to go to the municipal archives in Shanghai and, find those good things, the blueprints, right? The documents about these seminal buildings that I was going to focus on for my master's thesis. And when I came to the archives, I showed up and I was so excited to be there. And I had a letter of introduction, and they said, "Oh, you know, it's great that you're here, but you can only check out or you can only look at 10 items. You have to list the 10 items. And in addition to that, your list has to be stamped by a faculty member at a local institution." And none of these requirements had been disclosed to me before. And so I tried to do the thing. I went to Tongji University. Through connections, networks are so important. You got to build a good network. I was able to get my stamped list of 10 things, but halfway through looking at the 10 things in the archive, I realized this is not enough, right? This is not what I came here to do. This is not a master's project. What am I going to do? And I started asking other people about their experience researching in archives in China. And what I found was that it is hard to gain access, especially to publicly available records of buildings, because, in some cases, they might now be turned over to the government or the Chinese Communist Party. And so they don't necessarily want you to have the original documents for those buildings. And so I was thinking to myself, as I'm finishing my master's thesis, I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I want to do a PhD, and I want to do research. What will that look like if I can't get into the archive? And really, that was the genesis of this project. And I'm so grateful that it happened. I'm so grateful that I had those 2 weeks of chaos and frustration because it pushed me to move beyond what was a fairly typical architectural history project that looked at great architects and wealthy clients in one particular condition, a post-colonial or semi-colonial condition, right? And it pushed me to do something different. And that's how I came to look at the city as built and in visual culture. So, what I'd like to do today is bring you through a little bit of my methodologies, and then I'd like to talk to you about where I think this particular research is going. So, on your screen, isn't that a beautiful image? What a beautiful image. So, that's the cover of The Builder, and it's sort of an amalgamation of the most fantastic buildings that were built in Shanghai, maybe the most famous of the year 1936, professional journal that circulated widely in this context. And my research goes beyond those documents. So yes, I look at the physical fabric. Yes, I look at, the official records, the meetings of the Shanghai Municipal Council, the professional journals, right? The work that those groups do. But early in my PhD years, I was introduced to the work of Zeynep Çelik, and she had this really beautiful, very, very short article on triangulation. And this methodology for historians suggests that if you are looking to advance a scholarship that is not just about, for us architectural historians especially, not just about, great architects and great buildings, you don't necessarily have to set aside all of the wonderful research and work that has gone into understanding people like Laszlo Hudeg, who built this fabulous skyscraper in Shanghai for a very, very wealthy client. You can look at that, and then you can also bring in other voices. And it's those voices in conversation, it's those interlocutors that really make something a substantial, nuanced history. So that's where I began. And so I have the physical fabric, go as much as possible to see the building, right? Find the official journals, find the archival materials. I'm so lucky because UVA libraries got access to this massive digitized archive of these materials during my PhD journey. And then also popular visual culture. So popular print magazines, pictorial magazines, which are magazines that use primarily visual content. So if you think of like the New Yorker, if it was all pictures, or like Mad Magazine or something like that, very engaging, aimed at the middle class, accessible, right? So I'm thinking about what are the ways that architecture and the constructed environment appears in these sources, these popular sources, and what might this tell me about, architectural history, the architecture, the fabric of the city in Shanghai during the 1930s. Now, for me, what was particularly interesting about this is that many of the histories of Shanghai that have been published, or had been published really at the moment that I was doing my historiography and so on, they did not, or they could not figure out how to access the perspectives of the average person living in Shanghai. What do normal everyday users think about the city? And so in a way, these sources that were, like wonderful image on the right-hand side of the screen is not produced by an architect. It's not produced by an urban planner or someone who was promoting the building of this skyscraper. Instead, it's a critique that's found in these popular sources about skyscrapers. It's really asking, why are we building them? Who are we building them for? Who is excluded from their centralities? So that's what I was able to learn from these sources. It was amazing. It really opened my eyes to an entirely different perspective on Shanghai's architecture. So what's great about this particular perspective that unites popular visual culture, architecture, right, as built and as imagined, is that it allows us to think about art. And I'm sure that all of you have wonderful works of art in your home that somehow, in some way, represent the constructed environment. I'm sure all of you do. So this is something that unites us as humans. And it doesn't matter what time period you're thinking about, what geography, I mean, really across the globe, people are creating works of art, literature, plays, music that think deeply about the places and spaces that they create. And there are a lot of different people, or not different people, different creatures around the world that create beautiful architectures. But humans are the only ones that really create art about the spaces that we live in. So that's something that I think is really profound. So, as I mentioned, previous studies of the Park Hotel, Laszlo Hudek, fabulous architect, really interesting client, director of the Joint Savings Society, Wu Dingchang, right? A lot of studies focused on fellows like those. And the Park Hotel is a really interesting example of this methodology in practice because it was essentially the sexiest skyscraper in Shanghai in the 1930s. It was the tallest building in East Asia. It was, it had the most high-tech technologies, that had lavish materials. It was an elite space of culture, right? And so it also was tied to the narrative of Shanghai's transformation into a modern global city. And it has been tied to that narrative in other architectural histories for decades. So what happens if you trace this history from other voices? So this is what visual culture allows me to do. Really, you might be wondering what else could possibly be said about this hotel, this skyscraper. And it turns out quite a lot because there are quite a lot of voices that are missing from those narratives. So this is my diagram, but it's not very diagrammy. The thing about architectural historians is we really do need to get better at designing things. Um, and I wish that I could say that I learned lessons from my brilliant colleagues, but I did lean upon a lot of their ideas. And I think that my work is really in conversation with so much of what we've seen today. It's been wonderful just to be an audience member and think about ideas like informality, about voices that have been overlooked, about sort of the tragedy of the commons, which comes up in another chapter for my work, but and really about the different ways that we, as people who are studying the constructed environment, are always thinking about the history of the constructed environment. So this is sort of like a visual representation of many of the things that I looked at. My 3 chapters: skyscrapers, I looked at slums or informality, and the Lilong and Shukumen. But if we just look at the skyscraper, we have, it's, we can trace it in professional journals, right? A lot of material about this particular building. But when you start to trace the same types of images in visual culture, what you see is on the right-hand side of the screen, we have an image from the cover of The Builder, another professional journal, thinking about pile driving. One of the seminal things you have to do to build a really tall building in Shanghai is have a really good foundation. And at the center of the screen, you have a picture or imagined view of a boss, right? A blue-collar worker and a dead body. And the title of this, the cover, is Negotiating for Compensation, right? This suggests that there is a completely different way to understand the context of the building site in Shanghai during the 1930s. These were incredibly dangerous sites, and in places across the world that it could be very different contexts. So the Empire State Building, built around the same time, much, much, much taller, far fewer accidents, far fewer fatal accidents than you were seeing in Shanghai during this time. Modern Sketch is thinking about this, and Modern Sketch is a pictorial that I really primarily focused on for my dissertation. A little bit left-leaning, beautifully produced, highly respected by the local artists, cartoonists, and so on in Shanghai during this time. A really fruitful terrain for thinking about popular visual culture. So here are some of the critiques that I traced. Skyscrapers are useless and unprofitable. That really undercuts one of the major narratives that to this day, as architectural historians, we sort of perpetuate. Oh, people build skyscrapers because they're going to make a lot of money. When you really dig into that narrative, you find that while they are a really great way to signal your brand name, a lot of times, I think in the COVID world, perhaps we're more attuned to this reality. You need to rent out space in those skyscrapers to make money. And today, as in 1930s Shanghai, a lot of times there would be a skyscraper that was built. And, you know, at the end of the day, the client is in the red because they're not able to fill all the spaces in that skyscraper. And that's what, some of these images show, that they're useless, right? They're not serving anyone really. In fact, they're injuring some people. Some people are completely excluded from the skyscraper at all. And they're not making anyone any money. So again, exclusionary, that they promote decadence and waste. On the right-hand side, on the bottom of the screen, you have this image of two young people who are squandering their parents' hard-earned money by going to fancy places like the Park Hotel and enjoying a drink. But my favorite is really top right-hand corner. And the caption reads, "The King Kong lifestyle of the modern Chinese university student." So you can see him up there. He's got a tiny little lady in one hand and a martini glass in the other. And you have to wonder how much learning he's doing on top of his skyscraper in the middle of the city. That they're poor measures of progress. Skyscrapers have typically been equated to ideas of, the modern growing city. We still are in this race to the heavens in terms of the way we build skyscrapers, the way we celebrate skyscrapers. But, you have to wonder, are they really showing us that we are all that modern, that we are all that progressive, that life is, and society is constantly improving? I'm not sure. Really, overall, skyscrapers for over 100 years have been oftentimes a corollary for, or a symbol of the progress, the modernity, right, of a particular city. It's cosmopolitan nature. And what I trace in visual culture is a questioning of that, that search for modernity, that contest in the city. And it's one that I think really complicates the urban history of Shanghai. But if you apply this methodology to other places and spaces and really carefully look at visual culture and the way we're picturing cities, it's a methodology that you can use to think about cities, the way they formed, what voices are being included in them, and their histories all over the globe in different times and contexts and spaces. Current projects. Okay, so I am doing some sort of normal stuff. Like I was very pleased to be the moderator of a panel at SAH in their virtual sessions with Xichao, with Bo, with Dongzhe, who's not here, and a number of other colleagues on really the state of preservation and so on in Shanghai. I'm excited to be at Seesaw, the Southeast chapter of the Conference for the Society of Architectural Historians, in a couple weeks. So see you there if you're going to be there. But another thing that is really wonderful about the PhD program is that it really is interdisciplinary. And so one of the great joys was being able to take classes beyond our discipline. And this led to a paper that is forthcoming in the journal A Modern. And it is not on architecture. It is really thinking about literacy in Shanghai during the 1930s and the pictorial magazine as a way, as like a tool for literacy, a popular tool for literacy. During this time, there were varying levels of literacy. And what's wonderful about studying this publication for a long time is that I was able to unpack that. And I had the depth of knowledge because of my studies here at UVA that went far beyond the architecture school. It was really fabulous. I'm also thinking very deeply about how to include these methodologies in my teaching. And so I'm currently teaching a course at SCAD called Analyzing the City in Film and Media. And so I am forcing them to apply my methodology to London and to New York. And we are doing a digital humanities project based in ArcGIS story maps. So I'm really excited to have the students really practice this kind of methodology that brings them beyond teleological narratives of history and really allows them to think creatively about what kinds of evidence they're going to pull from visual culture to talk about architectural history. I'm also very excited to design some classes for study abroad for SCAD. So I want to talk about that now to just really like dig the knife in for all of you. So SCAD has a campus in Lacoste. where we're able to teach, but they also allow us to design study abroad programs all over the globe and bring our students to any country we're allowed to go to for 2 weeks of intensive study. And so I'm working with a professor in the cinema studies department to basically take the analyzing the city and film and media on the road. I'm really hoping to bring students to China and think deeply about the different places and spaces that have been pictured in film and media and give them an opportunity to see these places, as they are built, right? Really using the full methodology that I am invested in and think about the importance of architectural history and visual culture in tandem in place. So this is really what I'm hoping to do in the future. And it's really a pleasure to talk about it. And I know that many of you are current students in the constructed environment. And I want to say that, 3 years ago, I didn't know that I'd be standing on the stage telling you about the things that I'm excited to do next. And I know that you're going to be here someday too. So you may not know exactly what's in store for you, but it'll be a really great adventure. So thank you so much for having me.
Wow. I remember that I arrived in 2012 in this institution. I think Kelly was the first graduate student who walked into my room telling me that she taught English in Shanghai or in China, and then you wanted to do a Master of Architecture History. Amazing. Okay, so that's my bit of a nostalgia, and thank you so much. This is really, last time I heard you talk about your work, and it was in the context of defense and of your dissertation. This is totally another level, the way you talk about it. Yeah, so this is really quite amazing that a few years can do to you, and hopefully, to the rest of the cohorts. Okay, let's move to our next presentation by Katherine Silverman. Oh, okay. So it's going to be on, let me just read your title. Katherine Silverman is Academic Program Manager and Sustainability Capstone Instructor at the City College of New York. Maybe you can begin by telling us what that means.
So I was the first person to accept the offer of admission, but I'm also probably the longest person to have ever been in a PhD program, maybe ever. So now that Kelly has given you such a wonderful introduction to what your careers might look like, let me tell you what not to do, because I am still waiting to submit my draft. And so this is all very much in progress, and I value any feedback you have or pushback. In the 10 years that I've been in the constructed environment program, which is nearly a third of my life, so much has changed, and I'm going to cover a lot of that ground. But one thing that hasn't changed is my title, and I'm concerned about that. So it is Retrofitting for Resilience, looking at multifamily housing in New York. And we're also going to talk about some of the issues with skyscrapers. So thank you for the skyscraper segue, Kelly. So New York is a really unique landscape. I'm sure I don't have to really tell anybody that. But we are a city of 2/3 renters. So very much at odds with the home ownership model and the American dream of the rest of the country. 1/10 of our housing units are public or receive subsidies, so they fall under the category of rent regulation. Most housing is multifamily. It's not single family traditional homes. It's apartment buildings, skyscrapers. Most of those are luxury and problematic. We'll get into that. And a lot of our housing, our multifamily units, are in the floodplain, which has been a large focus of climate adaptation and resilience over the last decade. And our housing stock is old. 1/3 of the housing stock in New York was built after 1960, and that still very much falls under the category of like luxury high rises. So not what the typical New Yorker is really living in. And we're a really mixed bag of building owners because there are a lot of, nefarious landlord structures in New York that I feel like are present everywhere, but are maybe not as ubiquitous as they are in New York. So this is looking at Hudson Yards construction of more luxury housing, adding to our housing stock, but not necessarily getting people homes. So we're also a city, and this is like much of the US and the world, we're a city of compounding crises, climate and housing. And especially since 2014, when I started the program, there have been a lot of new studies published about this. And there are a lot of people looking at this. Under Mayor Bill de Blasio, there was a Housing New York plan to build and preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing. And most recently, Mayor Eric Adams reintroduced Plan YC, calling it Getting Sustainability Done. So there are these, there are these two sort of things guiding my project that are also just what I feel like are really just talked about constantly in New York. If you encounter a New Yorker, the first thing you talk about is how expensive it is to live there and whether or not your subway station flooded that week. So it is still front of mind 10 years later. But during the time that I have been in the program, I was really interested in retrofitting and thinking about how can we make our housing stock more resilient to climate change, while also maybe making it a better place to live and more affordable. And there's been a lot of work in that space. There are directories of different housing programs that offer tax abatements in mostly in the camps of either energy efficiency or flood proofing, which I've always kind of equated with more of the climate change mitigation and more of the adaptation areas. But there's so much going on, and I will go on to the next slide, looking at my notes. And so this is a bit on the landscape of existing opportunities and why it's still a problem. So there are many, many ways that you can get a tax break as a building owner in order to bring your building up to code, or to bring it into a more energy efficient state to get our city toward carbon neutrality. But we have a very, very piecemeal and confusing landscape of just tax breaks. You still have to find a way to come up with the upfront investment as a building owner or portfolio owner. And we're largely a city mired in unfunded mandates. So there are a lot of requirements to become energy efficient, but there isn't necessarily money behind that in order to actually make a building more energy efficient. So you either see a lot of these upgrades being distributed onto the renters in the forms of hiring their rents, or it becomes almost impossible to avoid the fines. And I actually am now a homeowner in an apartment building in New York City, and we can't figure out how to comply with some of these energy efficiency laws, despite the fact that I'm thinking about these things like an alarming amount of time. So we also, we're using, especially for affordable housing development in New York, a lot of federal options that don't really meet the needs of that unique multifamily housing landscape. And a lot of opportunities are pilot programs. They're things that have expiration dates. And incentives typically require like meeting a long list of specifications, tons of stipulations, loan terms. Eventually you have to pay the loan back. And so upfront investment just beyond regular building maintenance. So we've seen this with especially with Local Law 97, which requires buildings over 25,000 square feet to become more energy efficient. So, what do we do about that? We make the landscape a little simpler, because what this also does is it means it does work for some people. If you're a big portfolio owner, you own hundreds of units across the city, and you have somebody dedicated to finding what all these opportunities are and maximizing your incentives, you can probably make it work. But if you're a small building owner who's just renting out units to New Yorkers, that's going to be really hard for you to even access some of this opportunity and funding. So sorry, this lost some pixels in the process of going to PDF, but what we don't have is a systems approach to our buildings and to renovating our buildings, to bringing them up to not just code and energy efficiency, but just like quality standard housing, just heating and cooling, just having hot water when you need it. And everything that we've been trying to do in New York is, looking at the constants, parameters, and numbers. So through tax incentives, and not really getting at the heart of what needs to be done here in order to make New Yorkers comfortable in their home, which, especially in the case of affordable housing, that's long-term homes. The goal is to keep people in those homes. So even though they don't fit the traditional ownership model of the American dream that you need to own your house, this is where they're going to be for decades. They should have a say in what's happening, and they should have their basic needs met before anybody's worried about an LED light bulb. Like that's the base system. Another issue with a lot of what we already have in place is it doesn't make much space for living things. This is not necessarily true when we're talking at the grander community scale. This is just showing 3 examples of, larger than site-specific interventions that involve natural berming or spaces that are swaled, they're meant to flood. But at the building scale, we don't really have that. We kind of just start and stop with hard interventions like flood walls, flood vents, moving HVAC systems. We don't leave a place for biophilic design in what we're doing. And there's some reason for that, like how do you bake that into a tax break to add plants to a building? So that's why I've been trying to find a new way of doing that within the systems that we already have. So I really like Shahab said earlier, incremental abolitionist. That is very much how I see this project. Like I'm still gonna say money is the problem, and we need to, create new systems of getting money to building owners and to the people in them. But like, yeah, and policy is the problem, but maybe we can get further down that places to intervene in a system incrementally if we start with, okay, this isn't really working out. So people who live in New York knows what needs to be done, and we have a lot of data in New York to back that up. That is one really great thing about this massive city of data, is that it is all transparent and made available and updated regularly. That has also been a huge problem with my project, because I was just talking to Nana earlier that I don't know where my data stops. Like I don't know what day. Like I actually looked up some of these stats for 311 this morning just to confirm that they were still correct, and it's like, where do I cut it off? So 311, and New Yorkers past or present in the room, feel free to push back on this, but 311 is a pretty good source of what's plaguing New Yorkers, what's bothering people, because it is extremely accessible. You can call, you can use online. It's available in dozens and dozens of languages. And even if the problem doesn't get solved, it does get documented. So for example, if you're experiencing ponding in your neighborhood on a regular basis, if your building's flooding and you're not sure why, generally in New York, you could not get your landlord on the phone about that. So here's a way to sort of hold them accountable in some regard. And at odds with that, we have the big focus of resiliency data in New York, which is, thinking about flood mapping and inundation and, very, very rigid. What is the boundary of the 100-year floodplain, and how do we plan for climate resiliency?
All the information if you want.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Happy to collaborate on flood maps. So yeah, so getting to the information that actually is representative of the people who live in these neighborhoods and live in their homes, and not what FEMA is telling you, you need flood insurance because you live in this one spot in the city. Somebody who's living in a neighborhood and says they're seeing flooding and it's impacting them negatively on a regular basis, that should be the information that we're using in order to make resiliency adjustments. So my goal is a new financing pathway that does not rely on tax breaks and tax incentives, but instead a new revenue stream that would just enable grants to be given out to building owners, but with the stipulation that they need to bring a certain percentage of units in their building into permanently affordable housing. So we have a lot of ways of creating and preserving affordable housing that come mostly from the federal level, but how can we actually just create affordability in New York and not have somebody look at like a scary bill of retrofits that they need to eventually pay back? Can it just be a grant? And then they know that like their rent rolls and their bottom line is going to be okay if they're getting a grant. And how do we include tenants in that conversation? So the way I've been thinking about it is almost mirroring like the public comment process for any other major resiliency projects. Is if you're a 20-unit building, you're getting $20 million to make whatever upgrades you need to. You'll have to go through a process of just including your tenants in that conversation and taking their needs seriously. I don't know how that would be enforced. So that's what I've been dealing with for quite some time now, 6 or 7 years. And so obvious challenges with this, as I mentioned to Nana earlier, it's not a fast moving target like AI is. That's on another level, but there are new programs, new pilots, and new incentives being introduced every day through avenues that exist, like the Retrofit Accelerator with New York City. We really need a simplified means of turning tax dollars into grant funding, which is a whole political policy bureaucratic landscape that's really dense and complicated, but it needs to happen for like a number of reasons, because my worry then is, could this meet a similar fate to congestion pricing, which, if you're not familiar, New York had already invested a lot of money in congestion pricing, infrastructure and studies. And granted, it was not a perfect system. It was not going to, like, it was going to have environmental justice issues related to it, but it was going to help fund mass transit. And one morning, the governor just woke up and said, "I would prefer not to." So it's gone. And so, how do you prevent that type of thing from happening if you create even a new revenue stream? So that's the messy policy landscape that I'm in, and that's part of the reason why it's taken me so long to finish my dissertation. But here are some other reasons why as well. So for 3 years, I was a part of HPD resiliency planning. HPD is the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. So it's sort of two different things. It's the agency that builds and develops affordable housing in New York, but it's also the 311 agency, and housing inspectors are sent out from HPD. So a lot of the work that I actually did was exporting a lot of flood maps and trying to convince building owners who weren't necessarily in the FEMA floodplain that they probably still needed flood insurance. But what it did teach me was that we have a lot of well-meaning policy that gets in our own way. So that's what sort of brought me from more of like a design project. How do you intervene in all the different building typologies you have in New York, versus how do you just make sure they get the resources they need to operate and to modernize and to provide quality housing. So this is, just a few things that I worked on while I was there. And for the last 5 years, I'm now the assistant director of the CCNY Sustainability in the Urban Environment Master's Program. It is a fully interdisciplinary, shared amongst the divisions of the School of Engineering, the School of Architecture, the Division of Science, and the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at City College. And so I'm mostly like a program administrator. Like I said to somebody earlier, like I'm making sure we have enough chairs in the room when we schedule a class somewhere in order for everybody to attend and sit down. But I'm also the academic advisor in the program. And I've been able to oversee a lot of really exciting student projects and help them with a lot of their visions. It's a program of about 80 full and part-time graduate students at any given time. And it really is truly interdisciplinary. So just to highlight some things, the house student, Alex, is in the center of the top left image, because Zihao and I work together at City College, and he is actually extremely helpful in leading and taking on student projects, because oftentimes it's hard to get faculty involved in an interdisciplinary program that won't support their tenure. So it's really fantastic to have him overseeing projects. And Alex worked on a sort of thesis equivalent project looking at the implications of Local Law 97 and energy efficiency upgrades for West Harlem and how they could potentially lead to gentrification, because they could just make rents higher. And so in addition to that, I've been able to serve on our sustainability council for the campus. So trying to sort of find the right students who are interested in the right things to support facilities management in trying to get sustainability projects done on campus. So for example, right now, several of my students have been applying for Inflation Reduction Act grants to get things installed on campus. And a meeting I missed today was involving the installation of a biodigester on the 9th floor of the Science Building. I'm a little scared about that, but I'm excited to see what it looks like when I get back. And then by way of the interdisciplinary nature of the program, but also CUNY, we operate with very little resources, and it's often hard to have new hiring lines for faculty. So kind of by default, I've become a bit like an instructor. It says adjunct instructor or capstone instructor in some of my title, but I do get to support student projects in areas that are of particular interest. So when I was at HPD, for example, I got to work on the hazard mitigation plan for the city of New York. And now I can bring students who are interested in hazard mitigation planning to the New York City Office of Emergency Management, and they will work together on community-centered hazard mitigation approaches that involve real actual embedding. Most of the students live in the neighborhoods that they're working in, and do hazard mitigation planning from a community-centered and just lens. And then another just example of a project in 2020, when everything was shut down and skyscrapers were losing a ton of money. I thought about, well, what if we converted them to housing? What does that look like in the mess of policy and the mess of zoning that is New York? And that was a further help into understanding that we have a lot of really well-meaning policy that gets in the way. Two students, Rachel Bernstein and Olivia George, put together this rendering of a floor plan of a building that was actually for sale in the beginning of the pandemic, and what that would look like. And the biggest issue they ran into was that lot line windows that are in between the two buildings would make it impossible for anything on the left side of the building to be considered a bedroom. And it's like, instead of getting people into homes and places to stay, we're worried about 20 years down the road, might another building go up and block the windows. And the developer, or the realty agency that was in charge of selling this building actually took their plan and included it in the selling documents. So they thought there was going to be some opportunity there. And then finally, a lot of students have been mobilizing around decarbonizing the campus. And so we've had a series of events where I'm kind of just a stage manager. And it's really exciting to see their work with very little resources doing really incredible things on the campus, like installing a biodigester and a campus microgrid, and conducting a waste audit. So I'm really lucky to be in this role where I'm working in higher ed, but not really in academics. So I also just get to spend a lot of my time talking to students. And so one other excuse for not having finished my dissertation is that when I first started, a lot of people in the program were having kids. And I remember joking to Nana, don't worry, never going to happen to me. You don't have to worry about that. I'll be out of here. And I lied. My now husband was working at Apex Clean Energy here in Charlottesville, and we welcomed our daughter, Sasha, in November of last year. So I do now have a baby that's, about 1.5 miles away right now. So yeah, for better graphics and maps, please do come back for my dissertation defense. But in the meantime, I really appreciate any feedback or thoughts you have. And I want to thank you for letting me speak, even though I'm not Ph.D. done. Thank you for that. And I really want to thank Nana, who's really tolerated me for a decade and been an incredible leader. And right after we finish this session, I'm going to be going to lead a Zoom with my students on diagramming. So after all the grief I had with diagramming, I make every grad student do it because it's so valuable. So thank you.
Okay, Shanghai, New York, I can see some. I know your works are very different, but it's really about challenges of really highly dense urban environments. They're just 1930s in Shanghai, today in New York, energy, urban culture. Yes, they're different, but then there are some connections. This is probably the questions are going to come from that direction. Thank you so much for the presentation. So we have our third presenter, Dijia, who just got out of the bed in ungodly hours in Melbourne, Australia. So I'm going to leave her to tell us a little bit about yourself, but she is now lecturer in architecture history and theory at the Melbourne School of Design, University of Melbourne. I just want to say that this is just equivalent to tenure track position because they don't really have those titles. And substantiation, I guess, is the next thing to happen. But anyway, so it's a pretty good position that she's holding. Thank you, Dijia. Take it away.
All right, so hi everyone. This is Dijia Chen presenting literally at 6 a.m. in the morning from literally the other side of the world. So as Shichao said, I'm currently working as a lecturer in architectural history and theory at the University of Melbourne. Yeah, I don't like the sound of that. I want to be called an assistant professor, but they don't have that. And and guess what? You get to be a senior lecturer after, you know, after the confirmation. So a long way from actually being called a professor. Maybe I'll achieve that when I'm 60. So I started my appointment in August and still trying to wrap my head around everything here. From the tenure evaluation system down to the tradition of Ph.D. supervision, everything is really different and something you might want to learn about in advance if you ever plan to find a job outside the US. So today I'm going to try my best to make my presentation fun and concise since I'm the last one and most of you are probably quite sleepy by now. So basically I'm going to talk a little bit about my doctoral research, something I thought I'd never have to talk about again after I defended it. And so I'm also going to take some time and talk about some other research projects that are on my mind at the moment, and essentially my plan to move beyond my current focus and into topics that I believe can be more relevant in the world today. So the original title of my dissertation was Dissenters Unfettered, the Making of Contemporary Chinese Architecture in the Exhibitionary Context Zone. I'm currently in the process of reconfiguring it into a book and have changed the title to Journey Through an Exhibition, the Displaced Making of Contemporary Chinese Architecture. I do feel like this is a better title. The original one is a little confusing due to word choices. So this research started with my own experiences with exhibitions on contemporary Chinese architects during my master's in Shanghai, where I observed a significant disjuncture between the specific image presented by the so-called independent or avant-garde Chinese architects and the architectural production that I have witnessed in China, which is more characterized by collectivism and plan economy and facilitated through large-scale design institutes. So when most people talk about the quote-unquote contemporary Chinese architecture today, they're usually referring to names like Wang Shu, Yunho Chang, and Ai Weiwei, who are mostly doing small-scale, indigenously inspired, independent practices and has high media exposure. If we expand the list a little bit, the discourse of contemporary Chinese architecture is still largely revolving around this small circle of about 10 architects. Most of them are male, and they can hardly represent the majority of building constructions in China. This disparity between the two sides of China's architectural production prompt me to question the transnational construct of third world cultural identities in a hyper-mediatized and globalized world. So my research is really about challenging this default understanding of contemporary Chinese architecture by telling its origin stories from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. In my dissertation, this story is unpacked by anchoring a constellation of historical processes through a pivotal moment that, from my perspective, defined the emergence of contemporary Chinese architecture as we know it today. And that is the 2001 exhibition, Tumu Young Architecture of China in Berlin. Unlike many large-scale and well-curated hallmark exhibitions in the modern architectural history, this exhibition is held in a small and dim gallery space featuring only 4 architectural studios, 1 artist, and a group of 4 university-based architects. The exhibition was hastily put together with limited resources, and most of the exhibitors only had 1 or 2 built projects in their portfolio. Nevertheless, Tumu marked a historical moment when the previously neglected and marginalized independent experimental architects was first spotlighted abroad. It has thus initiated a series of major changes both in China's domestic architectural community and in world architectural discourse. So by dissecting the historical moment profiled by Tumu, This research is concerned with the perceptual and practical transformations that were facilitated by the happening of Tumu, and how the exhibition-related narratives and messages impact China's architectural community through cross-border meaning-making, as well as how these transformative processes inform us of the status of the design industry in China at the time, and what routes and conditions are continuing to shape the cultural landscapes and urban realities in China today. I mainly mobilized the concept of context zone as my theoretical framework. The term context zone was first proposed by Mary Louise Pratt to describe those spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power. It was further brought into museum studies by James Clifford and into the studies of architectural exhibitions in recent years by two professors from ETH. While the original theoretical framework assumed exchanges under primarily post-colonial contexts, I extend the use of context zone in temporary exhibitions, looking at them as the center of multi-sited and interwoven communication, articulation, contestation, in a constellation of related events, processes, and transformations. The diagram on the left shows how my writing is organized, with the exhibition Tumu as an anchor point that shapes and reflects the historical changes in several main aspects of China's architectural community. And methods from curatorial studies and transnational cultural studies were also applied to conduct my research. So this chapter outline is from my dissertation, and it's going to remain largely unchanged for my book, if I get lucky. My chapter 1 is probably going to go and become part of an introduction because I want to just talk about the exhibition directly. But currently the chapter 1 of my dissertation introduces the background by delineating the peripheral yet impactful movements that spark the inclination to convey experimental design advocacies in the post-reform time. And chapter 2, which is going to be chapter 1 in my book, delves into the fortuitous and hasty processes through which Tumu was achieved. And the following 3 chapters explicate the impact of Tumu in China's domestic architectural community and the world architectural discourse from 3 angles: the collaboration between the quasi-cultural real estate developers and emerging independent architects, the pedagogical reforms, as well as the consolidation of the image of contemporary Chinese architects in foreign academic discourses. The tiny images on the lower right corner of each chapter are where I have published small pieces of these chapters here and there. I just had one paper that came out 2 months ago by GTA Papers, and I just got their paperback copy. And I have another paper that's coming up maybe in a month or 2 with architecture and culture. They have a special issue on architectural exhibitions as context zones. So how convenient is that? So I still need to talk about whether this is going to affect the publication of my book with the publisher. I'm not sure about that yet. Since I definitely do not have enough time to go through all the exciting findings of this research, I'd like to expand on the section on Wang Shu in one of my chapters to give you some ideas. So Wang Shu is arguably the most famous contemporary Chinese architect in the world today, since he was the first and only Pritzker laureate from China. And the project on this slide is one of his most famous buildings, the Ningbo History Museum. So if you know Wang Shu, probably know this project. So you can see the extensive expression of material, recycled tiles and debris from nearby villages that were demolished, and he tried to keep the memory for the locals by creating a facade out of that. Basically, he was praised for its political criticism on mass demolition and urbanization processes, as well as an awareness of local materials, recycling building debris in creative ways, etc. However, little did people know that his design were like this before the Tumu exhibition. So on the left, you can see a collection of his conceptual and built works from the 1980s to the 1990s. They were basically shaped by the imported postmodernism, understandings of semiotics, and deconstructivism in the 1980s. So really exemplifying abstracted geometry geometrics, intersecting volumes, disrupted pathways, and fragmented and ambiguous elements. And you can see that from his, these sketches, not really sketches, drawings. It also reflects the concurrent architectural movements at that time, which was imported to China. So they differ drastically from the works on the right, which emphasizes a composition of recycled clay tiles, meandering corridors with bamboo handrails, irregularly shaped window openings that look like Taihu stones and all that. So in this chapter, I traced Wang's professional trajectory with the exhibition Tu Mu as a pivotal turning point. I analyzed how the German curators and critiques' emphasis on traditional and indigenous materials at Tu Mu led to his dramatic turn towards critical regionalism in a highly visible manner, and how it was further propagated through his accidental involvement in the 2005 Venice Biennale, as you can see on the upper left corner. It was also where he established connections with a number of Europe-based architectural critiques, curators, and gallery directors. So I argue that the highly personalized stylization of Wang Shu's work seemed to align more with the branding demands of the global design market under hypermediatization and heightened consumerism. Wang's approaches have successfully established a canon of Chineseness, one that perfectly aligns with the demand to showcase the identities of third world cultures. And thus, Wang Shu's case demonstrated how the notion of Chineseness in contemporary Chinese architecture, as embraced and applauded by the European curators and critiques, is established through exhibitionary contact and representations. So this is the poster and one of the photos of an exhibition on contemporary Chinese architecture held at MoMA in 2021. From both the narrative and the selected works of this exhibition, we can see that the discourses initiated by Tu Mu continues to dominate exhibitions on contemporary China now. One recurring theme is really tied to a visibly identifiable perception of cultural identity that stems from readapted indigenous building conventions. And a generic appropriation of European modernism legitimizes these projects to be contemporary, while a romanticized version of an imagined localness represents the Chinese features. I argue that the concept of contemporary Chinese architecture inherently implies cultural homogeneity and the neglect of local specificities within the borders of China. An exhibition as a mode of knowledge production may be limited in its capacity to delve deeper into more nuanced and diversified subjects on contemporary Chinese architecture, particularly after the era of discovering China as an uncharted territory has elapsed. The so-called contemporary Chineseness is as represented by these architects is an identity constructed on imperial gazes and cultural differences. And this identity not only became a recognizable code on the international stage, but also influenced the design market, the educational programs, and the aesthetic perceptions within the domestic architectural community. Participation in international exhibitions, competitions, and publications subsequently became standards by which the younger generation of independent Chinese architects measured their success. I thus proposed the concept of what I call the Tu Mu era of contemporary Chinese architecture. And this term denotes the temporal span from the late 1990s to the early 21st century. It signifies more than merely the Tu Mu exhibition itself, but rather highlights an epoch characterized by the intricate interplay of transnational mediated exchanges, misinterpretations with undefined purposes, and rooted in a web of contingencies and evolving cultural dynamics. I'm currently in the process of developing it into a book, and I'm working closely with Bloomsbury because they're really professional in handling books with images, and I like their cover design. I might try for a university press for my second book in the future, but within a rather fixed time frame, commercial publisher seems to be more efficient for me at the moment. And apart from this book, there are also two papers coming, I have most of the materials, but I haven't got the time to sit down and write it out. Both are related very closely to my doctoral research, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the first one is called Individuality Revived, young Chinese architects debut in Japan-based architectural competitions. So 1980s was a very interesting time in China's recent history for a number of reasons. Not all are good, but it was definitely a time when the formerly repressed progressive ideas were allowed to burgeon after a long period of silence in cultural life. And for architects, it was also a time when the younger generation sought to restore the professional identity of architects as creative individuals and not just nameless staff working for efficiency and functionalism in big design institutes. So borrowing methods from queer studies on identity damage and narrative repair, and looking into how practices of visionary architecture in foreign competitions served as an outlet for creativity in their quest for individual expression. This was also entangled with China's relationship with Japan at the time, the sudden influx of foreign literature and theory into China, the liberal arts movement, among with other social cultural transformations. I'm also looking into how the exchange with Japan through these competitions foreshadowed the emergence of experimental architecture against the state plan system. So I've presented a preliminary version of this work at last year's SAH and was invited by the editors of JSH to submit a paper. So that's what I should be working on at the moment. Yes. The other project investigates anti-utopian fiction as architectural alternatives in post-reform China. So I will analyze the work of Liu Jiakun, a young architect disenchanted with the planning-based routines in design institutes and retrieved to novel writing as an expressive outlet in the 1980s. So you can see that I'm really fascinated by the 80s after doing my dissertation. Liu's ideas was influenced by the imported Western literature and postmodern theories. His novel imagined a failed totalitarian social experiment of a master architect, and it was banned from publication in mainland China until 2014. And this research will explicate early contemplations over the ideologized pragmatism by all political control and collectivism, and how these alternative attempts further informed Liu's professional practices today. So both projects are still closely related to post-reform China and experimental architects, and still based on a close reading of texts and images. Apart from these two projects, I'm recently coming up with a new research direction, just ideas that are vaguely taking shape. So I'm hoping to start a new research on the Asian diasporic queer community in Melbourne and how they live, how their lives shape and are shaped by urban spaces. This actually started with a phenomena that I have recently noticed on dating apps. There is a huge community of East Asian and Southeast Asian women in Melbourne that have come out as queer. And given my own experience as a Chinese woman born and raised in China, I have lived my life in a society with highly oppressive nature and rigidly fixed female identities. So I'm surprised how Asian women, many Chinese included, are comfortable with openly declaring their identities in Melbourne. And my first instinct is that this phenomenon is deeply intertwined with the traditional gender roles in Asian countries, the liberal structural conditions for queer communities in Melbourne, and Melbourne's history as an immigrant city, particularly with a large population of Asian immigrants. I have recently joined the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at Uni Melbourne, so really trying to get started and learn about the methods in urban history, and to see how marginalized social groups are empowered through autonomous spatial practices. I'm also discussing my ideas with one of the very few emerging scholars at Uni Melbourne who did his PhD with queer theories. So maybe in 3 to 5 years' time, we'll see what I can dig out of this topic. So you see that there's just so much I want to do, and let's hope I have the time and energy to complete these researches before I get interested in new ones. Yeah, so basically this is what I've been working on. I'm happy to take advice or thoughts you might have regarding my past research or my future research directions. And thank you so much.